It was a hot afternoon in the city. The sun was high, making the sidewalks warm underfoot and the air thick with humidity. People were going about their business, walking quickly to escape the heat or stopping at cafes for cold drinks. At a small corner cafe, a young black girl sat alone at a table outside, sipping water and watching the world pass by. She had a calm presence, almost like she was at peace in the chaos around her. A small bag rested on her lap, and she occasionally jotted notes in a small notebook. From across the street, a police officer noticed her. He had been on duty for most of the day and was feeling irritable. The heat, the traffic, and the noise of the city had worn him down. But more than that, there was a part of him that reacted to seeing her, a part that judged her before she even said a word. He crossed the street and approached her, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose. The girl looked up as he reached her table. She smiled politely, thinking he might be about to ask a question or offer assistance, which often happened in the city. But what happened next shocked her and everyone nearby. Without warning, the officer grabbed a bottle of water and poured it over her, drenching her from head to toe. The cold water shocked her skin and she gasped, wiping her face with her hand. The liquid ran down her clothes and splashed onto the table, leaving a puddle on the ground. People sitting nearby stopped what they were doing. Some stood frozen, mouths open, unable to believe what had just happened. Others reached for their phones, ready to capture the incident. The girl, though wet and startled, did not scream or lash out. She remained calm, blinking the water from her eyes and straightening her hair. She looked up at the officer, her eyes steady, and spoke in a quiet but firm voice. "Why did you do that?" she asked. Her words were simple, but the calmness in her tone made them carry weight. The officer, caught off guard by her composure, hesitated. He expected fear or anger, not a composed question. "You were standing there looking suspicious," he stammered. Though even he knew his excuse sounded weak. He tried to sound authoritative, but it came out as uncertain and clumsy. The girl shook her head slightly. "Standing here? Drinking water? That's suspicious." Her voice held a gentle but unmistakable firmness. People around murmured, some nodding in agreement with her logic. The officer's face turned red, a mix of anger and embarrassment. He wasn't used to being questioned, and certainly not by someone he thought he could intimidate. "You need to move along," he barked, trying to regain control, but his voice wavered. The scene was drawing attention, and he could feel the eyes of passers-by on him, judging him silently. The girl did not move. Instead, she carefully wiped the water from her face and adjusted her wet clothes, keeping her composure. A few bystanders stepped closer, sensing that something unfair was happening. An older man in a business suit shook his head. "Hey, that's not right," he said. "She hasn't done anything." Others whispered to each other, some filming discreetly, their curiosity mixed with concern. The officer looked around, realizing that the situation was no longer under his control. The small display of public attention made him even more defensive. "I said move," he shouted, raising his voice. The girl's gaze remained steady. She knew that reacting with anger or fear would only give him more power in this moment. Instead, she spoke again, calmly but with undeniable authority. "I am not doing anything wrong. I am not leaving because you say so." Her words were simple, but they carried confidence and poise. The crowd around them noticed this. A few people nodded quietly, impressed by her courage. Some even whispered encouragement to her, saying that standing up calmly against someone abusing power was the right thing to do. The officer took a step closer, leaning slightly as if trying to assert dominance. He had dealt with people like her before, people who questioned him or didn't immediately obey. Usually he could scare them with his presence, but something about her calm and measured demeanor unsettled him. He tried to hold on to his sense of authority, but it was slipping through his fingers. The girl stood up, brushing off the water from her clothes, and held her bag closer. "You poured water on me for no reason," she said softly, but every word resonated with clarity. "That is not how someone in your position should behave." Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't shout, but it carried more power than his raised voice ever could. People around them started to murmur louder. "What is he doing? That's ridiculous." Some called for calm, trying to prevent the situation from escalating, while others simply observed, watching an ordinary moment turn into something charged with tension. The officer felt his face heat up further, realizing that the public nature of his actions would not go unnoticed. His anger began to mix with panic. He had made a mistake and he wasn't sure how to fix it. I think you should go now." he muttered, unsure if he was giving an order or trying to defuse the situation. His words lacked conviction, and the girl could sense his uncertainty. She didn't move. Instead, she remained composed, standing tall despite the water soaking her clothes. A woman nearby, holding a coffee cup, stepped forward slightly and said, "He poured water on her?" "That's not right. Call someone." Her words added pressure. The crowd was growing, and the attention was shifting toward the officer's actions. He felt trapped, caught between his anger, his bias, and the public gaze. The girl, meanwhile, stayed calm, observing him as though reading his thoughts. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer took a step back, breathing heavily. He realized that continuing to act aggressively would only make the situation worse, but he still wanted to save face, to maintain some sense of authority in front of the witnesses. His eyes darted around, trying to find a way to regain control, but the girl's calmness and dignity made it impossible. She was not afraid, and that fearlessness undermined his entire attempt at intimidation. She sat back down slowly, still facing him, and picked up her notebook. The water on the table dripped onto the ground, marking the moment like a quiet testament to what had happened. She wrote something down, her movements deliberate, showing that she was unfazed. The officer noticed but said nothing, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words. The crowd continued to watch. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered to their friends, expressing anger at the officer's actions. The girl, still calm, finally spoke again.
"I suggest you reflect on your behavior."
"This is not how people should be treated." Her words were gentle but firm, and they hung in the air, carrying more weight than any shouting or threat could. The officer, feeling the eyes of everyone on him and sensing the growing disapproval, finally muttered something under his breath and stepped back. The moment was tense, but the girl had not flinched. She had maintained her composure, her dignity, and her sense of self-worth, despite being drenched and humiliated in public. The incident was far from over, but for now, she had stood her ground and commanded respect through calmness and courage. People around began to disperse slowly, though many continued to whisper and glance back at the scene. The girl stayed seated, taking a deep breath and reflecting on what had just happened. Even in such a small moment, she knew that standing calmly and clearly against abuse of power mattered. It mattered to herself, to the witnesses, and to anyone who might hear about the incident later. The officer finally walked away, muttering angrily under his breath, but the girl remained seated. She had not raised her voice. She had not retaliated with aggression. Her calm response had shifted the balance of power, showing that dignity and courage could overcome prejudice and intimidation. The crowd slowly returned to their routines, but the memory of the incident lingered in their minds, a reminder of the impact one person's calm strength could have in the face of unfairness. The tension in the street lingered long after the water had been poured. The young girl had remained calm, but the officer's anger simmered beneath the surface. He tried to regain his composure, straightening his uniform and adjusting his belt as if that could restore the authority he felt slipping away. People were still around, some whispering, some shaking their heads, and some quietly recording what had happened. The weight of their eyes pressed on him, and for the first time, he felt the discomfort of being watched while he was clearly in the wrong. The girl stayed seated at the cafe, her notebook open, pretending to write something. She knew that staying calm and measured was important. Any sign of fear or anger could give the officer an excuse to escalate, but she had learned to control her reactions, to remain steady even when facing hostility. She could feel the tension in the air, the way people around her had turned from casual passers-by to silent witnesses. Everyone could sense that this was not just a random altercation. It was a test of character, and she intended to pass it with dignity. The officer took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had been trained to handle confrontations, but this was different. There was no immediate crime, no clear reason to assert authority. The girl's calmness was a mirror reflecting his own aggressive behavior, and it made him uncomfortable. He glanced at the small group of people who had gathered, noticing the expressions on their faces. Some looked shocked, some angry, and some curious. They had seen what he had done, and he knew that their impressions mattered. Even in public, a person's reputation could shift in an instant, and he could feel it slipping away. "Look," he said, his voice less certain now, "I don't know why you are making a scene." His words were meant to intimidate, but the lack of conviction made them weak. The girl looked up at him and smiled faintly, not mocking, just confident and unshaken. "I am not making a scene. I am simply existing, and you decided to pour water on me," she replied calmly. The clarity of her words made the officer hesitate. He opened his mouth to argue, but no excuse came to mind that felt reasonable. He could sense that any justification would be hollow, and deep down he knew it. The crowd continued to grow slowly, people stepping closer to see what would happen next. The girl noticed the movement but remained calm. She wanted to make sure that nothing would escalate into violence. Her posture was composed, her gaze steady, and she projected an air of quiet authority that unsettled the officer even more. She realized that in these situations, controlling one's own emotions was often more powerful than any word spoken. "You need to leave," the officer said again, trying to regain his previous assertiveness. This time there was an edge to his voice, a mix of frustration and desperation. The girl shook her head, not with anger but with resolve. "I am not leaving because I have done nothing wrong," she said. "You are the one who acted wrongly." For a moment the officer seemed taken aback. Most people would have either apologized immediately or attempted to fight back with anger. Instead, she stood her ground calmly, and that made him question his actions. The heat of the day and the rising tension around them added to his discomfort, but he tried to maintain control, to convince himself that he still held authority in this situation. As he spoke again, his words became more defensive. "You are going to get yourself in trouble standing here like this. You should just go." He was hoping to scare her with vague threats, but she was unfazed. Her calm demeanor and clear sense of self-worth made his words meaningless. She could see that his attempts at intimidation were failing, and she used that knowledge to remain composed. Some bystanders began to speak up. A man holding a briefcase said, "She hasn't done anything wrong. You are the one causing trouble." Another person, a woman carrying groceries, nodded in agreement. The officer looked around, realizing that the situation was no longer private. Everyone could see what had happened, and he felt the eyes of the crowd like a weight pressing down on him. Each judgmental glance made him more uncomfortable, and he could feel the growing sense of accountability forming around him. The girl adjusted her notebook and pen, pretending to write something down. Though her mind was fully aware of the unfolding situation, she knew that remaining calm and collected was the most effective response. The officer's anger was palpable, and he was searching for a way to assert dominance, but every move he made only revealed his insecurity. "Please, just leave," he said, his tone now a mixture of pleading and frustration. The words did not carry authority anymore. They were weak and desperate. The girl looked at him without fear. "I will not leave because I have done nothing wrong. You need to reflect on your actions," she said softly but with undeniable confidence. Her words carried weight, and the people around her seemed to recognize it. They continued to watch silently, sensing that the officer's behavior would have consequences. The officer's face flushed as he realized that no amount of yelling or threats would change the situation. The girl's calmness, her refusal to react with anger, and her steady presence had shifted the power dynamic. He had expected fear or submission, but instead he was faced with dignity and quiet strength. That realization made him uncomfortable, and he stepped back, unsure how to proceed. A few more bystanders gathered, some filming on their phones, others whispering to each other. The girl remained composed, her posture upright, her gaze steady. She had learned that in these moments, maintaining self-control and dignity was far more powerful than any display of anger or fear. The officer, meanwhile, was caught between the instinct to assert authority and the growing awareness that he was the one being judged. After a few moments of silence, the officer muttered something under his breath and started to walk away. He felt a mix of relief and humiliation. Relief that the confrontation was ending, humiliation because he realized that his actions had been wrong and had been witnessed by others. The girl watched him leave, her calm expression never wavering. She knew that the encounter was far from over, but she had already won the first round by standing her ground with dignity. The people around her began to disperse slowly, though many continued to whisper and glance back at the scene. The girl remained seated, taking a deep breath and collecting herself. The heat of the day and the tension in the street still lingered, but she felt a sense of quiet victory. She had faced an act of prejudice and abuse without losing her composure or her dignity. She knew that standing firm in the face of injustice mattered. not just for herself but for everyone who witnessed the incident. As the officer disappeared down the street, the girl closed her notebook and took a moment to reflect. The world could be harsh and unfair, but she'd learned that calmness, confidence, and self-respect were powerful tools. Even when faced with someone abusing authority, it was possible to maintain one's sense of self and respond in a way that commanded respect. The street began to return to normal, the sounds of traffic and conversation filling the air, but the memory of the encounter lingered in the minds of those who had seen it. The girl knew that this was only the beginning of a larger story, one where courage, dignity, and quiet strength would continue to play an important role. The city street was quieting down slowly, but the tension from the earlier incident still hung in the air like a thick fog. The young girl remained seated at the cafe, her notebook open but untouched for the moment. She took a deep breath and looked around at the few lingering witnesses. Most people were resuming their routines, but some kept glancing her way, their expressions a mix of curiosity and admiration. She knew that the encounter had left an impression, that her calm strength had been noticed and perhaps would be remembered. The officer, now a short distance away, had stopped and was pacing. He muttered to himself, trying to rationalize his actions, but every thought he had only reminded him of his mistake. He had expected fear or submission, not a composed, confident response that exposed the ugliness of his own behavior. He realized that his attempt to assert dominance had completely failed, and he felt a growing sense of panic. What if this incident was reported? What if his actions were recorded and shared? His career, reputation, and sense of control were all at risk. Meanwhile, the girl stayed calm and collected, aware of the officer's agitation. She knew that moments like these required patience. Acting impulsively or showing anger could escalate things, but maintaining composure could influence the outcome more than any argument or confrontation. She watched him from a distance, noting his gestures, the way he ran his hands through his hair, the way he glanced around at the small crowd that had witnessed everything. He was rattled, and she could see that clearly. Then she made her decision. Slowly, deliberately, she stood up, adjusting her wet clothes and bag. Her movements were calm, deliberate, and without hesitation. She walked a short distance toward the officer, her steps measured and unhurried. The bystanders noticed her approach and murmured among themselves. There was a sense of anticipation, as if everyone sensed that something important was about to happen. As she reached him, she stopped and looked directly into his eyes. The officer stiffened, surprised that she would approach him instead of waiting for him to leave. Her gaze was steady, and there was a calm authority in the way she carried herself. She spoke softly, but every word carried weight. You need to understand that what you did was completely unacceptable. Abuse of authority and prejudice have consequences. The officer opened his mouth to respond, but his words faltered. He realized that no excuse would justify his behavior, especially when confronted with someone who held herself with such dignity and composure. He felt a growing sense of fear, realizing that this moment could change the course of his career. The girl's calmness was a mirror, reflecting the truth of his actions back at him, and it made him uneasy. She continued, her voice steady and unwavering. I am not just anyone you can intimidate. Your actions have been seen and recorded, and there will be accountability. Her words were simple, yet they carried an undeniable authority. The officer's hands trembled slightly as he tried to maintain a composed appearance. He was no longer in control. The power had shifted, and he could feel it keenly. Suddenly, the girl reached into her bag and pulled out an official-looking badge. She held it up calmly, revealing her true identity. The officer's eyes widened in shock. I am a police chief, she said softly. I was undercover to observe behavior and integrity within the force, and your actions have been noted. The realization hit the officer like a wave. Everything he thought he knew about the situation was false. The person he believed was just a random girl had been testing him, observing his conduct, and now he faced the undeniable truth of his wrongdoing. His face turned pale, and he stumbled back slightly, unsure how to respond. The crowd of witnesses gasped, some whispering, some staring in disbelief. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The balance of power that had once belonged to him had completely disappeared. Wait, please, he stammered, panic evident in his voice. I didn't know. I didn't realize. His words trailed off. He was pleading now, a stark contrast to the aggression he had shown minutes before. The girl remained calm, her gaze unwavering, observing his reaction closely. She could see the mix of fear, embarrassment, and regret in his eyes. The bystanders watched intently, sensing the gravity of the moment. Some shook their heads, murmuring about the turn of events. Others held their phones, unsure whether to record or simply witness what was unfolding. The officer's colleagues, who had begun to arrive out of curiosity or concern, were equally stunned. They whispered among themselves, trying to comprehend the shocking revelation. The girl spoke again, gently but firmly. "Your behavior has consequences. Misuse of authority and discriminatory actions cannot be tolerated. You must reflect on your actions and accept responsibility." The officer's shoulders slumped as he realized the depth of his mistake. He had not only acted inappropriately, but had done so in a way that was now publicly documented and undeniable. As the tension continued, the officer tried to explain himself. "I was stressed, it was hot, I didn't mean to. I didn't know." His excuses sounded hollow even to himself. The girl listened quietly, allowing him to speak but not giving him the sense that his words could erase the truth. She noticed a few bystanders whispering, exchanging glances, some offering subtle support for her composure and courage. The city street had become more than just a public space. It had transformed into a stage where accountability and integrity were being demonstrated in real time. The young girl, once a seemingly ordinary figure, now commanded attention and respect through her calm presence and the revelation of her authority. Finally, the officer's voice faded, replaced by silence. The girl took a step closer, her expression gentle but firm. "You have a choice now. Accept responsibility and cooperate with the necessary steps, or face the consequences that will follow regardless." Her words were not threats but statements of fact, carrying the weight of someone who had both authority and moral clarity. The officer nodded slowly, the fight leaving him entirely. The arrogance and aggression that had driven his actions were replaced by shame and realization. He understood that this was no longer a matter of ego or pride. It was a matter of justice and accountability. The young girl had demonstrated that calmness, courage, and integrity could not only stand against prejudice but also expose it clearly. As the officer was escorted away by a colleague to begin the process of accountability, the girl returned to her seat. She picked up her notebook, writing briefly as she reflected on the incident. The city continued its rhythm around her, cars passing, people walking, conversations flowing, but she remained in her own space, composed and steady. She had faced an act of discrimination and abuse, revealed the truth, and ensured that justice had begun to take its course. The witnesses slowly dispersed, many looking back, still processing what had happened. Some whispered about the girl's bravery, some about the officer's shocking revelation, and some simply marveled at the unexpected turn of events. The atmosphere on the street was different now. A sense of respect and reflection lingered, and the lesson of accountability had been made clear. The girl, calm and unwavering, had turned an act of aggression into a moment of education and truth, leaving a mark not only on the officer, but also on everyone who had witnessed the encounter. The street had settled into a quiet hum, but the energy from the earlier confrontation lingered. The young girl, now clearly identified as a police chief in disguise, remained calm at the small cafe table, her notebook resting open before her. She took a slow breath, thinking about what had just unfolded. The officer, who had poured water on her moments ago, now stood a few steps away, visibly shaken and uncertain of his next move. The tension in the air was thick, like an invisible weight pressing down on everyone present. People in the vicinity had begun to gather, sensing that something extraordinary was occurring. Some whispered among themselves, speculating about what had happened, while others held their phones, unsure whether to record or simply witness the event. A few brave individuals, encouraged by the girl's composure, approached to offer quiet support. The officer's colleagues, alerted by the commotion, started arriving, faces painted with concern, curiosity, and disbelief. They murmured to each other, trying to process the revelation that one of their own had just been publicly confronted by a police chief. The officer, pale and trembling, took a step toward her, hands slightly raised as if to plead or negotiate. I didn't know. I didn't realize who you were," he stammered. His voice was small, lacking the authority he had displayed just minutes ago. The young girl regarded him with calm, unwavering eyes. She did not rush, did not raise her voice, and did not exhibit any sign of fear. Her presence alone conveyed authority and composure far stronger than any loud words could. "It doesn't matter what you thought," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with quiet power. "Your actions were unacceptable. You poured water on me. You acted out of prejudice and you misused your authority. That is the reality and it cannot be changed by excuses." The officer's shoulders slumped slightly as the weight of her words sank in. He could feel the judgment of the crowd and the invisible pressure of accountability pressing down on him. The girl continued, addressing both him and the growing audience. "Abuse of power and discriminatory behavior are serious. They harm individuals, damage trust in law enforcement, and cannot be tolerated. You must take responsibility for what you did." Her words were firm, yet there was no malice in them. They were simply truth, delivered calmly and clearly. The officer's hands trembled as he ran them through his hair, trying to regain composure. I am sorry. I didn't mean to. I didn't know." His voice faltered, and he realized that apologies alone would not erase the impact of his actions. The girl remained seated, observing him without interruption, giving him space to confront the consequences of his behavior. She knew that allowing him to speak, while maintaining her own calm authority, was more powerful than any display of anger or judgment. The bystanders whispered among themselves, some expressing disbelief at the turn of events, others expressing quiet admiration for the girl's composure. They had witnessed a display of courage, calm, and dignity that few could ignore. The atmosphere shifted. It was no longer just about the incident itself, but about the lesson it carried. Accountability, integrity, and the quiet strength to stand firm in the face of wrongdoing became the focus. And everyone present could feel the weight of that lesson. The officer's colleagues had gathered around, observing the interaction with a mixture of shock, concern, and curiosity. They whispered to each other, trying to reconcile the image of the officer they knew with the behavior they had just witnessed. The young girl addressed them briefly, her voice carrying authority without hostility. "What has happened here is a reminder that integrity must guide our actions, whether we are on duty or off duty. Accountability is not optional. It is part of our duty to the public and to each other." Her words resonated with the officers, creating a moment of reflection and introspection. The officer, now realizing the seriousness of the situation, began to plead more earnestly. "Please, I didn't mean any harm. I was frustrated. I didn't know who you were. Please, can this be handled quietly?" His voice cracked, revealing genuine fear and regret. The girl looked at him steadily, her eyes conveying both understanding and firm resolve. She knew that fear and regret were not enough. Real accountability required action and reflection. "This cannot be handled quietly," she said, her tone calm but unyielding. "What you did has consequences and you must face them. Misuse of authority and prejudice are not minor offenses. They are serious violations of the trust placed in law enforcement officers." The officer's face turned pale, and he nodded slowly, understanding that the path ahead would be difficult. The bystanders continued to watch, some recording, some whispering, but all paying close attention to the unfolding events. The young girl's calm demeanor and measured words had transformed what could have been a chaotic scene into a moment of reflection and accountability. The officer's fear and regret were evident, and it was clear to everyone present that he was beginning to comprehend the gravity of his actions. A few moments of silence followed. The girl allowed the officer to gather his thoughts, to confront the consequences of his behavior, and to feel the weight of accountability. The street seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next step in this unusual confrontation. Finally, the officer spoke again, his voice low and trembling. "I understand. I will accept responsibility. I will cooperate. I'm sorry for what I did." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of acknowledgement and remorse. The girl nodded slightly, recognizing the sincerity of his response. Acknowledgement is the first step. Reflection and corrective action must follow. You will be held accountable, and steps will be taken to address your behavior. This is necessary for justice, for the public, and for the integrity of law enforcement. Her words were calm, authoritative, and precise, leaving no room for misunderstanding. The officer's posture slumped further, but there was a sense of relief mingled with the lingering fear of consequences. As the officer prepared to follow her instructions and begin the process of accountability, the bystanders began to disperse slowly. Their whispers continued, some expressing admiration for the girl's calm authority, others discussing the officer's apparent remorse. The city street slowly returned to its usual rhythm, the sounds of traffic, conversation, and daily life filling the air once more. Yet the memory of the confrontation lingered, a quiet reminder of the power of composure, dignity, and accountability. The young girl returned to her notebook, writing briefly as she reflected on the events. She knew that the incident had not only revealed the officer's misconduct, but had also set an example for those who had witnessed it. Standing firm in the face of wrongdoing, maintaining calm and dignity, and insisting on accountability were lessons that resonated beyond the immediate moment. They were lessons about integrity, courage, and the importance of confronting prejudice without losing composure. She looked around the street one last time before gathering her belongings. The witnesses had mostly left, and the officer was being escorted by colleagues to begin the necessary procedures. The young girl walked away slowly, her steps measured, her demeanor calm. She knew that her actions had made a difference, not just for herself but for the community, and for the officers who would reflect on the importance of integrity in their own behavior. As she disappeared down the street, the city continued to hum with life, but the impact of the encounter remained. People would remember the calm strength, the authority without aggression, and the way accountability had been enforced without hostility. The lesson was clear. Courage, dignity, and ethical leadership could challenge prejudice and demand responsibility. And in that moment, the young girl had embodied all of those qualities, leaving a lasting impression on everyone who had witnessed the confrontation. The incident on the street had become the talk of the neighborhood, and the officer who had poured water on the young girl was now facing the real consequences of his actions. The police chief, still calm and collected, led him to a nearby police vehicle where he would be taken for an internal review. The officer's demeanor had completely changed from the moment he had first approached her. His arrogance had vanished, replaced by fear, regret, and uncertainty about what lay ahead. Inside the police station, the officer was guided to a small room where he would provide a detailed account of the incident. The chief sat across from him, her posture steady and authoritative. She allowed him to speak first, giving him the chance to explain himself, though she knew that his excuses would not erase the truth. I was frustrated. It was hot. I didn't know who she was, he muttered, his voice trembling. Each word sounded hollow, even to him, and he realized that there was no way to justify his actions. The chief listened silently, her eyes steady and calm. She did not interrupt, but her presence alone was enough to make him feel the weight of accountability. She had witnessed his behavior firsthand, and had seen how he had attempted to intimidate someone he believed was beneath him. Now in the quiet of the office, with no audience except her, the reality of his misconduct pressed down on him more heavily than it had on the street. Stress or heat do not justify the use of authority to demean or harm another person, she said finally, her voice soft but firm. What you did was unacceptable. It violated the standards of our department and the trust placed in you as an officer. Your actions will be documented, reviewed, and addressed appropriately. The officer nodded, swallowing hard. He could feel the truth of her words settling in, heavy and undeniable. As part of the review, the chief asked him to reflect on his behavior. She wanted to ensure that he understood not just the immediate consequences, but also the deeper impact of his actions. Think about the person you affected, she said. Consider the humiliation, the fear, and the message your behavior sent. How will you make amends and prevent this from happening again? The officer hesitated, struggling to find the right words. He had never been asked to truly reflect before. Most of his career had focused on enforcement, not introspection. Meanwhile, the community was buzzing with news of the incident. Witnesses who had recorded the event shared their videos online, and discussions about accountability and integrity in law enforcement began to spread. People debated the behavior of the officer, but many praised the young girl's composure, her courage, and her ability to handle a tense situation with calm authority. She had shown that dignity and strength could influence outcomes far more than aggression or anger. Back in the station, the officer continued to provide statements, answer questions, and review video evidence of the incident. Each moment made it clearer to him that there would be tangible consequences for his actions. He would face disciplinary measures, including potential suspension, retraining, and mandatory reflection sessions. The realization that his career could be at risk weighed heavily on him. He had thought he could intimidate, control and act without accountability, but now he saw that his actions had consequences that could not be ignored. The chief guided the process with care and fairness. She was firm but not cruel, ensuring that the officer understood the seriousness of his actions while also giving him an opportunity to accept responsibility and demonstrate genuine reflection. She knew that punishment alone was not enough. Real change required understanding, awareness, and a commitment to improve. She asked him repeatedly to reflect on how his behavior affected others and what steps he would take to prevent similar incidents in the future. As the day progressed, the officer's colleagues began to learn more about the incident. Some expressed shock at his actions, unable to reconcile the image of their co-worker with the behavior they had witnessed. Others expressed relief that the chief had been directly involved, ensuring that accountability was immediate and visible. Conversations in the precinct shifted from casual work talk to serious discussions about ethics, integrity, and responsibility. The incident had become a catalyst for reflection among many officers, not just the one directly involved. The officer was required to write a detailed report, documenting every aspect of the incident, his thoughts, and his reflections. He struggled to find words that conveyed genuine remorse, realizing that honesty was the only path forward. The chief reviewed his statements carefully, asking questions, seeking clarity, and ensuring that he took full responsibility for his actions. There was no opportunity for excuses, and he began to understand that true accountability meant acknowledging the harm caused and committing to meaningful change. In the community, the impact of the incident continued to resonate. Witnesses shared their stories, emphasizing the young girl's calm strength and the officer's subsequent accountability. Conversations about prejudice, power, and integrity in law enforcement gained momentum. People recognized that this was not just a single incident, but an example of how courage and ethical leadership could create change. The young girl had demonstrated that standing firm, maintaining composure, and insisting on accountability could influence both individuals and institutions. Back at the station, the officer completed his review and reflection sessions. He met with the chief one last time before being released for the day. His posture was subdued, his voice quieter, and his demeanor more reflective than before. "I understand now," he said softly. "I see the impact of what I did, and I will work to make sure it doesn't happen again." The chief nodded, acknowledging the sincerity of his words. "Understanding is the first step," she said. "Action and integrity must follow. Ensure that you uphold the standards expected of you, and that you reflect on your behavior continually. Accountability is ongoing, not a single event." The officer left the station, a changed man in some ways, though the full journey of reflection and improvement would take time. The experience had been humbling, uncomfortable, and instructive. He had faced public embarrassment, personal regret, and the firm guidance of a leader who demanded accountability. The incident would remain a powerful lesson, both for him and for those who had witnessed it. The young girl returned home, reflecting on the day's events. She had turned a moment of aggression into an opportunity for accountability and education. Her calm demeanor, ethical leadership, and insistence on reflection had ensured that the officer faced the consequences of his actions and had set a clear example for the broader community. She knew that integrity, composure, and courage were not just ideals but tools that could create meaningful change. By the end of the day, the city had absorbed the lesson quietly, but powerfully. The incident had been witnessed, shared, and discussed, leaving an impact that went beyond the immediate participants. The officer had faced accountability, the community had witnessed courage, and the young girl had demonstrated the power of calm strength and ethical leadership. It was a day that reminded everyone involved that actions have consequences, that integrity matters, and that courage and composure can influence both individuals and institutions in profound ways. The days following the incident were filled with reflection and quiet change. The officer who had poured water on the young girl faced formal disciplinary action within the department. His peers had witnessed his misbehavior, his confrontation with authority, and his subsequent remorse. Meetings, reports, and review sessions filled his schedule, and he found himself forced to confront not only the impact of his actions on the girl but also the way his behavior affected the perception of law enforcement in the community. The young girl continued her daily routines, carrying with her the knowledge that her calm and composed actions had created a ripple of accountability. She remained humble, not seeking attention or praise, yet she understood the importance of her role in this situation. Her ability to respond with dignity had not only held the officer accountable, but also provided a powerful example for the community. People she had never met reached out to express their admiration for her courage, noting how her composure had transformed a moment of aggression into one of justice and learning. Within the department, the story spread quickly. Officers discussed the event in private, reflecting on the importance of ethical behavior and integrity. Some admitted that they had been shocked by the officer's actions, realizing that anyone could make mistakes under pressure, but that accountability was essential. The young girl's example prompted informal conversations about professionalism, respect, and the importance of self-control. These conversations, small as they might have seemed, began to create a culture of awareness and reflection. The officer, meanwhile, went through a process of formal retraining and reflection. He attended sessions on bias, ethics, and public responsibility, each step challenging him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and his behavior. He was required to write detailed reflections on his actions and their impact, not only on the young girl but on the community he served. At first he approached this reluctantly, but over time, he began to recognize the value in understanding his own prejudices and mistakes. The process was humbling and difficult, yet it forced him to see the importance of accountability and growth. The young girl followed the progress quietly, knowing that change often started slowly and required patience. She did not seek recognition, but she observed the small shifts in behavior among officers and the increasing awareness within the department. She understood that one moment of courage and composure could influence many, and that the ripple effect of accountability often extended far beyond the immediate incident. In the community, the impact of the event continued to resonate. Witnesses shared the story with friends, neighbors, and coworkers. Discussions about integrity, fairness, and the proper use of authority became more common. People began to recognize the importance of standing firm in the face of injustice, of maintaining dignity, and of insisting on accountability when wrongs occurred. The incident became a reference point, a reminder that courage and ethical leadership mattered deeply in everyday life. The officer gradually began to change his behavior. He became more aware of his actions, more thoughtful in his decisions, and more conscious of the impact of his words and gestures. He could not undo the past, but he committed himself to learning from it, to correcting his approach, and to respecting the responsibility entrusted to him as a law enforcement officer. His growth was slow, marked by moments of struggle and reflection, but it was real, and it was guided by the clear example of accountability he had experienced. The young girl continued her undercover work in the department, remaining vigilant and committed to observing and improving the culture of law enforcement. She approached each day with calm determination, understanding that change often required patience, empathy, and resilience. Her actions had demonstrated that integrity, courage, and composure could transform even the most challenging situations into opportunities for reflection, learning, and growth. Over time, the story of the incident was shared as a lesson within training sessions and community meetings. It highlighted the dangers of prejudice and abuse of authority, the importance of accountability, and the power of calm, dignified response. The young girl's example became a symbol of ethical leadership, showing that one person's courage could influence many, promote reflection, and inspire change. The officer continued to face reminders of his actions, but he also experienced the benefits of learning and growth. He began to approach his duties with more care, more attention to fairness, and a deeper understanding of the responsibility placed upon him. His transformation, though gradual, illustrated the potential for accountability and reflection to create meaningful change, even in situations where harm had already occurred. The young girl, as she reflected on the series of events, recognized the importance of every choice she had made. Her calmness had prevented further escalation, her composure had commanded respect, and her insistence on accountability had sparked a broader dialogue about integrity and fairness. She understood that ethical leadership required not only courage but also patience, empathy, and a steady commitment to principles that could withstand challenge and provocation. The community and the department began to heal and grow, influenced by the lessons of the incident. Conversations about bias, respect, and ethical responsibility became more frequent, and individuals within the department began to take responsibility for their behavior more seriously. The incident, while rooted in conflict and aggression, had produced a meaningful opportunity for growth and reflection, demonstrating that courage, dignity, and accountability could have lasting, positive effects. In the end, the young girl's actions stood as a testament to the power of ethical leadership and composure in the face of wrongdoing. The officer learned a hard lesson about prejudice, misuse of authority, and the consequences of unethical behavior. The community witnessed a moment of courage and integrity that left a lasting impression, and the department began to take steps toward a culture of reflection, accountability, and respect. The story ended not with anger or humiliation, but with growth, learning, and the quiet triumph of ethical leadership in action.